It is not the first time, it is not the second, it is episode after episode, playing out across diocese after diocese, always following the same recipe. When a group of faithful requests the ancient Mass, the institutional response is to remove it, reduce it, restrict it further. That has been the pattern for 5 years now, consistent enough to no longer surprise anyone who has been paying attention. And then, recently, a bishop did the exact opposite. He did it at the precise moment when a genuine rupture was unfolding inside his own diocese, at the worst possible moment by every conventional calculation of institutional risk management. By the end of this video, you will understand why his decision may be the single smartest pastoral move the Catholic world has seen in years, and why it could show every other bishop watching a path forward that the last 5 years of restriction never offered. Begin with the background, because the pattern this bishop broke did not emerge from nowhere. In 2007, Benedict XVI issued Summorum Pontificum, liberalizing the ancient Mass and restoring it to full and unrestricted citizenship within the life of the Latin Church, available to any priest who wished to celebrate it without requiring special permission from his bishop. In 2021, that freedom was reversed. Traditionis Custodes returned the ancient Mass to the status of an exception, granted sparingly, subject to permissions that could be withheld, delayed, or quietly allowed to lapse. Since that reversal, the same recipe has repeated itself across diocese after diocese, in country after country, with a consistency that by now amounts to a documented institutional pattern rather than a series of isolated local decisions. In Camden, New Jersey, the ancient Mass at a particular parish was suppressed. The permit was simply not renewed when it came up for its periodic review, and the final celebration under that authorization took place at the end of June. The faithful attached to that community had asked. They had written letters. They had pleaded with their bishop directly. None of it changed the outcome. In France, at Versailles, an agreement had actually been formally signed, guaranteeing the ancient Mass every Sunday and on holy days throughout the year. And then, for 3 specific Sundays in August, the celebrant simply disappeared from the schedule with no explanation offered. The faithful, on their own initiative, located a fully qualified and available priest willing to step in. The diocese declined to authorize him. 3 Masses now sit at risk of cancellation despite a signed agreement that was supposed to guarantee exactly the opposite outcome. In Paris, a chapel regularly attended by several hundred faithful was scheduled to be abandoned entirely by the archdiocese, justified officially by the cost of necessary building restoration. Only sustained protest from the parishioners themselves succeeded in reversing that plan and keeping the chapel open. Taken together, these 3 episodes, and dozens of others like them across multiple countries in the years since 2021, reveal something more coherent than a series of unconnected local administrative decisions. They reveal a pattern, not a loud, formal ban announced with fanfare, but a slow asphyxiation carried out through the ordinary mechanisms of diocesan bureaucracy. Permits quietly not renewed, celebrants left unauthorized without formal explanation, schedules shifted and disrupted until the community attached to that liturgy simply grows exhausted and gives up asking. And behind every single one of these episodes are real people, not administrative abstractions. Families who drive dozens of kilometers, sometimes across an entire region, to reach the one remaining chapel where the ancient Mass is still offered on any given Sunday. Elderly parishioners who organize carpools among themselves because public transportation cannot reliably get them to a Mass time that keeps shifting without warning. Young people who, year after year, genuinely do not know whether the community that has formed their spiritual life since childhood will still exist by the time they are old enough to raise their own children within it. What has this 5-year pattern of restriction actually produced, measured honestly against its own stated goals? Not peace, not the unity its architects claimed to be pursuing. Division, bitterness, And in a significant number of documented cases, faithful Catholics who have simply lost trust in the institutional church's willingness to accommodate their spiritual needs at all, regardless of how patiently and how respectfully those needs were expressed through entirely proper channels. This is precisely where the news from these past days enters the story, because it breaks the pattern in a way that deserves careful attention rather than a passing mention. The setting is Scotland, in the Diocese of Aberdeen. The bishop there is currently facing a genuinely painful situation, one that would test any diocesan leader's judgment under real pressure. On July 25th, on a small island in the Orkneys that falls within his territorial jurisdiction, an episcopal consecration is scheduled to take place without the Pope's mandate. The facts, stated plainly, and without editorializing or rushing to judgment about motive, are these. A religious community that had formally reconciled with Rome in 2008 and was subsequently established as a canonical institute in 2012 has, in recent months, taken a different trajectory to the point of no longer recognizing the current pontiff as legitimate. The bishop responded by writing a pastoral letter to his diocese. He explained plainly that the planned consecration would constitute an act of schism under the Church's own understanding of that term, and he urged his faithful not to participate in it or to lend it any form of support. Up to this point in the letter, everything proceeds exactly as anyone familiar with how these situations are normally handled would expect. But within that same letter, there is a second announcement, and it is the one that almost no one anticipated. In the same document where he distanced himself and his diocese clearly from the impending schism, the bishop simultaneously expanded the availability of the traditional Roman Rite Mass across his diocese. In a church where it had previously been celebrated only once a month, it will now be celebrated every single Sunday. Pause here, because this specific gesture deserves to be understood carefully rather than passed over quickly as a minor administrative footnote to the larger schism story. Faced with the genuine risk that some of his own faithful people drawn to the beauty and solemnity of the ancient liturgy might be tempted to follow the schismatic community precisely because that community was offering them something they could not easily find within ordinary diocesan life, the bishop did not respond by closing doors further. He opened one. He did not tell his faithful, in effect, that the ancient Mass itself was the underlying problem requiring containment. He told them something entirely different. You already have the ancient Mass here, inside the church, every single Sunday, without ever needing to go looking anywhere else for it. And this is precisely where the deeper error of the last 60 years becomes visible with real clarity. Because the actual question facing the church was never really how much of the ancient Mass should be permitted, doled out carefully like a limited and potentially dangerous resource requiring strict rationing. The real question has always been a different one entirely. Where do we want the faithful who desire this liturgy to actually find it? If a family genuinely desires a solemn liturgy, meaningful silence, a tangible sense of the sacred in their worship, that family will go looking for exactly that, wherever it can actually be found. And if they cannot find it within their own parish, within the ordinary structures of diocesan life that should have been able to provide it for them, they will eventually go looking elsewhere. Taking something away from people does not extinguish the underlying desire that drew them to it in the first place. It simply displaces that desire toward wherever it can still be satisfied, including, in the most extreme cases, toward communities that have severed themselves entirely from communion with Rome. This is exactly what has happened across large portions of the Catholic world over the past 5 years, and anyone willing to look honestly at the actual pattern of departures and defections has already seen it unfolding in real time. The Bishop of Aberdeen appears to be one of the very few diocesan leaders who has genuinely understood this dynamic before it produced an irreversible loss inside his own territory. What he offered his diocese was not a surrender to pressure, and it should not be mistaken for one. It was, in the most basic and traditional sense of the phrase, simply good pastoral care. A shepherd does not close the gates of the pasture in order to prevent his sheep from wandering away. He opens the gates wide enough and tends the pasture well enough that his sheep have no reason to go looking for grass anywhere else. And the numbers, when they are examined honestly rather than filtered through institutional talking points, consistently prove this bishop right. Wherever the ancient Mass is offered with genuine pastoral generosity, without suspicion, without administrative friction, without the constant sense that the community celebrating it is somehow tolerated rather than welcomed, churches fill. Young people arrive in numbers that ordinary diocesan parishes are increasingly failing to attract through any other means. Families return, and they bring their children, and their children in turn begin asking questions about vocations that would never have occurred to them inside a liturgical environment, offering nothing distinctive enough to compete for their attention against the wider secular culture surrounding them. This pattern is visible not only in isolated traditionalist strongholds, but in the pilgrimage to Chartres, which continues to grow year after year, and in the specific parishes across multiple countries that have reopened the ancient Mass after a period of suppression and have watched attendance rebuild from almost nothing into thriving communities within a remarkably short span of time. And the pattern runs in the opposite direction with equal consistency, which is precisely what makes it so instructive rather than simply anecdotal. Where the ancient Mass was removed over the past 5 years, nothing new grew in its place to replace what had been lost. The parishes that suppressed their traditional liturgy did not subsequently fill with young families drawn by a renewed and more contemporary form of worship. They simply lost the people who had been faithfully attending, without gaining any comparable new population to take their place. The pews did not fill with the young adults the restrictive policy was theoretically supposed to attract through a more unified and less divisive liturgical practice. The pews, in the majority of documented cases, simply emptied further, adding to a decline that was already well underway before Traditionis Custodes was ever signed. This is also not, despite how it might be framed by some of its more enthusiastic supporters, a genuinely novel pastoral insight discovered for the first time by one bishop in Scotland in the summer of 2026. It has happened before, and it happened previously at the very highest level of the Church's governance, with results that remain instructive for understanding the current moment. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI formally revoked the excommunications that had been imposed on the 4 bishops, consecrated without a mandate by Archbishop Lefebvre back in 1988. 2 years before that specific act of reconciliation, in 2007, he had already liberalized the ancient Mass through Summorum Pontificum, restoring it to its rightful place within the ordinary liturgical life of the Latin Church. He did not respond to division within the Church by tightening restrictions and narrowing the available space for traditional liturgical practice. He responded by expanding that space and extending genuine institutional generosity toward communities that had felt marginalized for decades. This approach did not, of course, resolve every underlying tension between the Church and traditionalist communities in one stroke. Serious disagreements remained unresolved even after 2009, and some of those same tensions are precisely what has produced the crisis unfolding again now, nearly 2 decades later. But for a meaningful stretch of years, that specific combination of liturgical generosity and canonical reconciliation held together a fragile peace that has now, under a very different set of policies, been torn apart once more. The medicine Benedict XVI applied in that earlier moment was consistent and clear in its underlying logic. Give rather than take away. Extend trust rather than withhold it as a precondition that first had to be earned through demonstrated compliance. And this is not simply a historical footnote confined to a single pontificate that has now passed into history. Something has genuinely been shifting in recent months across the wider Church, in ways that suggest the Aberdeen bishop's decision may be less of an isolated anomaly than it initially appears, and more of an early indicator of a broader change in direction. Pope Leo XIV himself wrote directly to the bishops of France, encouraging them specifically to show greater openness toward the traditional Mass within their own dioceses, a letter that Cardinal Sarah, among others, has publicly praised in unambiguous terms as a genuinely positive and necessary intervention. Several cardinals, including some who have historically held very different views from one another on questions of liturgy and ecclesiology, have publicly called in recent weeks for the restrictions imposed since 2021 to be meaningfully eased rather than merely administered with slightly more flexibility at the margins. And in the aftermath of the events surrounding the Society of St. Pius X consecrations in early July, several dioceses across different countries have reportedly reopened internal discussions about restoring celebrations of the ancient Mass that had previously been closed or significantly curtailed under the stricter implementation of Traditionis Custodes. The Bishop of Aberdeen, in other words, is very likely not alone in recognizing where the wind may now be shifting within the wider Church's governance. He may simply be, among those who have recognized it, the quickest and the most decisive in actually translating that recognition into concrete pastoral action within his own diocese, rather than waiting for further clarity or further permission from above before acting on what the evidence of the past 5 years has already made abundantly clear to anyone paying honest attention. In fairness to the architects of the original restrictive policy, it must also be acknowledged clearly that their stated concerns were not manufactured out of nothing and do not deserve to be dismissed with a simple wave of the hand. Those who promoted the restrictions beginning in 2021 genuinely claimed, and in many cases sincerely believed, that they were pursuing greater unity within the Church. They expressed real concern that closed communities, potentially hostile to the Second Vatican Council itself rather than simply attached to a particular liturgical form, might crystallize and harden around exclusive access to the ancient rite if that access remained too freely available without any accompanying formation in full acceptance of the Council's teaching authority. This is a legitimate pastoral concern in principle, and it should not be casually dismissed as though it reflected nothing more than institutional hostility toward tradition for its own sake. But a legitimate concern, however sincerely held at the outset, still has to be measured honestly against its actual results once it has been implemented and given several years to demonstrate its practical effects. Have the restrictions imposed since 2021 actually produced the greater unity their architects hoped for? Or have they produced, in diocese after diocese and country after country, precisely the opposite outcome: more division, more bitterness, more communities pushed toward the margins and, in the most extreme documented cases, toward outright schism rather than fewer? The honest answer, based on 5 years of accumulated and now quite extensive evidence, does not favor the restrictive approach, whatever the sincerity of the intentions that originally motivated it. So what does this one bishop's decision in Aberdeen actually teach the wider Church, beyond the specific and painful circumstances of the schism unfolding in his own diocese this particular July? It teaches something that deserves to be stated plainly rather than left implicit. Tradition is not an enemy requiring careful institutional containment and management. It is a resource, a genuine spiritual treasure that, when offered generously and without suspicion, draws people toward the Church rather than away from her. Where it is offered generously, people stay, and increasingly, people arrive who were not there before. Where it is denied or restricted, people leave, and very little of comparable spiritual substance arrives to take their place in the pews they have vacated. And it teaches something even simpler than that, something almost embarrassingly obvious once it has actually been demonstrated in practice, rather than merely argued about in the abstract. Pastors who genuinely trust their own faithful are rarely disappointed by the trust they extend. Because the ancient Mass, whatever institutional battles have been fought over its availability across the past 60 years, does not belong exclusively to one faction or one ideological camp within the wider Church. It is a treasure that belongs, in principle and by right, to the entire Catholic Church, available in theory to any member of the faithful who might come to desire it, regardless of whether they arrived at that desire through a traditionalist upbringing or discovered it independently as an adult, searching for something the ordinary liturgical life around them had not been able to provide. A bishop who makes that treasure genuinely and generously available to his people is not doing a special favor for one particular constituency within his diocese that happens to prefer an older liturgical form. He is simply doing the basic and unremarkable work that his office as a shepherd has always required of him. Perhaps it remains too early to declare with any real confidence that tradition has definitively triumphed across the wider church, or that the pattern of restriction that has defined the past 5 years has been permanently and irreversibly abandoned in favor of the more generous approach this one Scottish bishop has now demonstrated. The evidence for that broader claim is still emerging, and it would be premature to overstate what one diocese's decision, however well-timed and however wise, actually proves about the direction the universal church is heading. But when a bishop, facing the genuine and painful reality of schism unfolding within his own territory, chooses in that specific moment to respond by opening rather than by closing further, something has clearly changed, at least in that one place, and it is a change worth genuinely noticing rather than passing over quickly on the way to the next controversy. It is worth praying, sincerely and without cynicism, that other bishops facing comparable pressures in their own dioceses will look carefully at what happened in Aberdeen and choose to imitate it rather than continuing to follow the older and by now well-documented pattern of slow restriction that has produced so much loss over the past 5 years without producing the unity it was intended to secure. And if someone from your own parish, wherever you happen to worship, has quietly stopped coming in recent years because they no longer found there what they were genuinely searching for in their worship of God, this particular bishop's lesson applies just as directly to that situation as it does to the schism unfolding on a small island in the Orkneys. Before rushing to judge those who have already left, quietly and without dramatic announcement, perhaps the more honest and more searching question to sit with first is this: what, exactly, did we take from them that made leaving feel like their only remaining option? What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.